Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 Ways for Proving the Existence of God. In this video, we're going to be looking at objections to St. Thomas Aquinas' first way, the unmoved mover. Now, before we get into objection to this argument, it's important to note 2 things about this argument that will form our first 2 objections. First, the purpose of this argument is not to prove the Christian God of the Bible. Aquinas had another set of arguments with that goal. This means 2 things. First, any objections that this argument is insufficient to prove that God fall flat, since they're attacking a straw man. If that's your concern, you should rather take issue with that other set of arguments, which attempt to go from this amorphous, poorly defined thing that's like a god to the specific Christian one. Second, it means that anyone that claims that this argument proves God in any way beyond some nondescript pure actuality is simply incorrect. And you can completely object to them and that claim, because that claim is just wrong. It's not what Aquinas was attempting to do with this argument. It's not that the argument failed at doing that, it's that the argument was never meant to do that in the first place. So, this argument is insufficient by design. It's insufficient to prove anything but some of the most basic properties of such an entity. Those properties could just as easily be attributed to a grand unified theory of physics or something, or a theory of all physics, as they could to a conscious being, barring other arguments. Now, Aquinas is going to make other arguments that take it from that to something else. But with this argument as it stands now, God, as most people conceive it, has not been shown and has not been proven, even if you accept all the premises and you think it's valid. Right? This brings us to the second caveat, which is that Aquinas is relying on Aristotle's physics to make this argument. Aristotle, as wonderful as he was at many things, his natural philosophy has not aged well. This makes complete sense for Aquinas to be doing this, since more explanatory theories of the way physics works did not exist yet. And the good job of the scholastics was to take the Bible and Aristotle and make them make sense together. However, Aristotle's physics are just outdated. The rules of actuality and potentiality are entrenched in the idea that all things have a purpose, and the unmoved mover is inferred from the claim that the celestial bodies are eternal and move perfectly. That's the reason that this argument works, and we have to kind of brush over some of those details right now, because they're things that we don't believe anymore. Few, if any, people believe that there are crystalline spheres in the sky that rotate around the Earth and hold on them little lights that are the stars. Now, if you believe that, maybe this theory of science isn't that outdated, but for most people, it's going to be outdated. Most people today think that gravity moves the planets and stars, and that stars and planets can die and aren't perfect. Most people also think that not all objects have a purpose, or if they do, they probably only do so because they already believe in a god and a grand design, which is going to beg the question against the atheist for this argument. So while, for its time, this was a great and influential argument, if you believe in modern science, the argument just falls flat. So objection 1. If someone claims that this argument proves anything more than the simple necessary force which determines motion, they are incorrect. Aquinas never meant this argument to be able to prove the Christian God, and it does not. Objection 2. This argument relies on an archaic understanding of physics, which modern scientists reject. You can still hold on to Aristotle's physics over modern science if you want to, but there are quite a few things which would then become impossible to explain, like supernovas. According to Aristotle's physics that you need for this argument, the stars and everything in the heavens has to be perfect and moving perfectly and never stopping. So, with those 2 out of the way as being the 2 biggest and probably most persuasive objections we're going to cover here, let's move on to objections to premise 1. So premise 1 says change movement exists in the world. In effect, things go from potentiality to actuality. Well, following McTaggart's argument about the unreality of time, change in this way doesn't exist. There is no a series of time, no moving now. Objects are one way at one point in time and another way at another point in time. There's no important way in which they change from moment to moment. Objects are simply this way at one point and another way the next. This is an objection to the idea that we have some kind of potentiality and actuality. According to this, there's no sense in which that's real. In fact, we just have a lot of actualities going on. And so since change and movement doesn't exist in the world, we can deny this premise and be done with the argument. This is probably a radical view to take, but it's one way you can deny the argument, by saying change just doesn't exist. Continuing with that, we can go along with Hume. So Hume and the problem of causation is going to be necessary for Aristotle's idea of change and the movement from potentiality to actuality. We have to show that something is actualizing something else. Now, since causality is needed in this argument, we can't show that causality exists, at least if you will follow Hume. Or causality just doesn't exist, depending on your interpretation of him. For actuality and potentiality to work in this way, an actuality must cause something else to move from potentiality to actuality. Since we can only show that there is a constant conjunction between two events, not actual causation, we can't show that actualities actualize potentialities. So the whole system is going to fall apart. Objections to premise 2. Objection number 5. So premise 2 is nothing can be both potential and actual in the same property. If a log is potentially on fire, it is not actually on fire, and vice versa. Objection 5. This is the place that Aristotle's physics is really going to start to break down. How do we divide objects? If I take a very long, cold metal rod and heat it at one end, it is both hot at the heated end and potentially hot at the cold end at the same time. If we stopped heating it, the rod would actualize itself. The hot end would warm up the cold end, causing a problem for the next premise. How can we deal with this? Well, we might try to divide the rod into two separate objects, but then referring to a complex thing like humans as a single object seems impossible and concerning. We might say that the rod has parts, and one part is hot and one part is cold, but in fact there's a complete gradient all the way up and down the rod from very hot to very cold. And it's not that one part is hot and one part is cold, but every single molecule on that rod has a different amount of energy, and so is a different level of heat. And so unless we divide it into its smallest parts, we can't say something like that. One might instead try to claim that the rod was in the process of changing from potentially hot to being actually hot. So some parts were hot and some parts were not. But this would be problematic if we were actively heating one end and actively cooling the other. The rod is not in the process of changing temperature. In fact, it's being preserved exactly at two different temperatures. So the claim that it is an active changing doesn't make sense. So the idea that nothing can be both potential and actual in the same property is concerning and problematic. If something can be both actual and potential in the same property, it can in some way actualize itself, which breaks down the whole argument once again. Looking at premise 6, therefore objects cannot change themselves, they must be changed by some other actuality, since potentiality must be changed by actuality, and one thing cannot be both actual and potential. Beyond just cases like the one offered previously, where objects change themselves, there are more complicated instances of objects changing themselves, as long as object is considered sufficiently large. Aristotle allows for living beings to change themselves in some sense because they have a soul that's driving them, and that's the thing that's creating those actualities. But this premise runs into problems if non-living things can change themselves. Once again, Aristotle suffers from not having access to modern examples. There are plenty of machines which change themselves. A motion-sensing light changes itself from off to on. A self-driving car changes itself from being stopped to moving, even without a person, though they may still not be able to do that very well, etc. It seems there are plenty of things which move or change themselves. Something can go from potentiality to actuality without having something to intervene and cause it to do that. Premise 4, these other actualities must have themselves previously been potentialities which were actualized by some other actuality. Objection number 7. For this argument to get going, we need to create a chain of motion. The chain needs to be essentially ordered, which means that z is caused by y is caused by x is caused by w, etc. Or is actualized by, if you'd rather. One might imagine a set of gears, basically. They're all turning, but there must be one gear that is self-turning to start it all off. Because if all the gears were merely connected, they wouldn't be turning at all. And an important thing with that gear metaphor is you couldn't have a circle of gears turning each other. If we assume that this gear model of an essentially ordered series is an accurate representation of the way that change actually works, we're inclined to accept the conclusion that there is some unmoved mover, some first gear that's turning the whole complex. The problem is not that when given such a model, the conclusion follows, but rather that such a model doesn't map onto our experience of the world. It is not that if given an essentially ordered series, we would not conclude that there must exist an unmoved mover, but rather that the world doesn't behave like an essentially ordered series. Let's take a look at why. Imagine a possible world where only two objects exist, a very hot metal bowl and very cold water inside that bowl. In the beginning, the water is actually cold but potentially warm. The bowl is actually hot but potentially cool. As time passes, the bowl becomes cool and the water becomes warm until they equalize. The water is changed by the bowl, but the only thing which changes the bowl is the water, since there is nothing else in this possible world. This is not an essentially ordered series, since the two things change each other and are changed by nothing else. To say that this is like a chain of gears is just incorrect, since two gears can't move each other without a force. And yet, in this case, change does occur without anything else present. Another instance of this deals with heavenly spheres, which Aristotle claimed could only be explained by an unmoved mover because they move consistently and they're always in a perfect motion and there's nothing else that's affecting them. The only way we can explain that movement and that change is through an unmoved mover of some kind. Imagine a possible world with nothing but a binary star, with two stars circling each other. They're held in perfect orbit around each other. The first keeps moving the second, while the second keeps moving the first. They cause change in each other, but do not require some external chain to cause them to change. There is no need for an unmoved mover. Premise 5, the chain of actualities cannot be infinite. Objection 8, even if we allow for the chain, which we cannot have loops of causation in the chain, that chain could either be infinite or have a starting place. The proponent of this argument might claim either that an infinite chain is impossible, or that the more likely explanation is that it has a starting point. For the first, though it's difficult to imagine things which are infinite, we encounter them all the time. The solution of calculus to Zeno's paradox shows us that infinite chains can still allow for motion. And in fact, motion requires infinite sums. I may need to move an infinite number of distances to move anywhere, but that doesn't imply that I cannot move. What is to say that all movement doesn't rely on an infinite chain of actualities? In fact, other elements of movement, such as all of Zeno's paradox, seem to imply that movement requires infinite chains to happen. So why would this idea of actualities be any different? In terms of the likelihood explanation, the claim that movement already requires an infinity of small movements in order to get any movement at all seems to justify it requiring other infinities be as good as any, beyond as good as the assumption of there being an end to that chain. The burden of proof rests squarely on the shoulders of those that claim there is some stopping point. There should also be a burden of proof on someone that asserts forcefully that there's an infinite chain. I'm not saying that that is a done and sold conclusion. I'm saying that it's likely enough that I don't see a reason to completely deny that and 100% accept the idea that there's an endpoint to that chain. As a skeptic, we can suspend judgment here between a stopping point and an infinite regress, since there's no solid proof either way. 9. This is an objection to the conclusion. Therefore, there must be some pure actuality, some unmoved mover, which is itself the cause of all motion, but is not moved itself. That unmoved mover is God. Setting aside the concern that even if the unmoved mover can be proven, it's not the God of the Bible, and all the other objections listed so far, this argument doesn't show that that mover is unique. Imagine that by unmoved mover, we mean a force of nature, such as gravity. Now, this might make some amount of sense, and it might actually counter some of our other arguments. If by unmoved mover we really mean gravity, maybe that would make sense of how in a world where the only things that exist are two binary stars, they wouldn't circle each other if gravity wasn't there as a force. And so maybe that force is really what this argument is getting at. That what Aquinas has actually proved and what Aristotle's actually proved is just the forces of nature that cause everything to change and move. They sound like a much better fit than God, first off. But setting that aside, such a force seems like the much more correct conclusion to this argument, at least if you believe in science, change, and causation. Physical forces cause all motion. Without them, even the bowl of water and the binary star would not move or change. However, that doesn't imply that there's only one force of nature, despite all of the works of physics to try to bring the micro-level interactions of physics in line with the macro-level interactions. We have yet to come up with some theory of everything of physics which explains both macro and micro-level interactions. The point is that even if this argument is successful in showing that there is at least one pure actuality, like gravity, it doesn't mean that such an actuality is unique and that there is only one. We may never come up with a grand unifying theory or a theory of everything with combining the grand unifying theory of all of the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force and electromagnetism with gravity. If that never happens, and this is a better explanation of this causal chain, it seems the causal chain shows that there's multiple movers. And going back to the gear metaphor, you could have a giant chain of gears and you could have two gears turning them. As noted at the beginning of this video, despite the objection to this argument, it was very powerful for the time. Modern Thomists may attempt to defend it by drawing comparisons to modern physics, rejecting modern physics, and asserting Aristotle's original version. Either way, the most convincing objection to this argument, in my opinion, is that it relies too much on an outdated model for the ways that things interact and change. We have a plethora of reasons for rejecting these old models, and therefore rejecting the foundation of this argument. And I think, as I said with those first two objections, the other objection that's the most convincing to me after that one is that, barring future arguments, which, as I have seen, are far worse than this, I see no reason to not just say, wow, that sounds a lot like gravity. That sounds a lot like electromagnetism. Something that causes all change, that can perfectly predict everything that's going to happen in the world and without which things wouldn't change? That sounds like a physical force of nature, not a conscious being. But that's more an abductive argument in terms of which of these situations explains it better than a perfect argument for this has to be what you're talking about. But the burden of proof is on the presenter of showing that this amorphous thing definitely isn't gravity, and it definitely is a conscious God of the Bible. I don't think that's been shown, but that's not what we're talking about necessarily here. So it's important to understand what the goals of this argument are and what they are not. Whew. All right. So that's the first of St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. Next up, we're going to take a look at the second, which is the first cause, a similar but importantly different argument, We're going to be taking a look at some of Aristotle's theory of causation in some short videos building up to that video, so that hopefully you can get a sense of what we're talking about when we mean efficient cause and final cause and all that stuff. Teleology is a little confusing. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.